Hello, and welcome to this week's lecture in communication technology. You know who I am. I'm Dr. Douglas Brunton, and this week the topic is the politics of gender and race in gaming, and the title of my presentation is Like You Play in Man. So, as we've been discussing in the past two lectures, machines and the systems that they run on and the apps that they facilitate all reflect the morality of their inventors, coders, and programmers. In other words, in no way are online spaces natively or objectively neutral. Rather, they are governed not by a process of machine logic, but in fact, they are an active political process, contextual in nature and firmly grounded in their socio-technical assemblage. Or, as Amiri Baraka writes, and you see on your screen, machines have the morality of their inventors. Writing in 1979, the author Michelle Wallace, in her book Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, identifies the power relations that work in the United States. Over 40 years later, in your readings for this week, two of the authors both ground their scholarship in the reality that this situation has not changed as the world has moved into a digital era. And in fact, the affordances of technology have made the world more toxic for everyone who is a non-white, non-cisgendered male. Writing specifically about gaming and video games, Anna Everett makes the point that informal surveys of video game cover art and game descriptions, print and online game reviews, manufacture strategy guides, and popular media coverage of expert gamers uncover not only an essential and privileged male gaming subject, but one who is universalized under the sign of whiteness. So when it comes to the issues of power, the last line of the Michelle Wallace quote, "The most important rule is that nobody fucks you," becomes most pertinent. For the purposes of our understanding the topic under investigation, this point also holds. Two of the authors, Anna Everett and Kishona Gray, are black women who game. People whose mature, black, and female bodies are marked and thus marginalized as shadow consumers in the gaming industry's multi-billion-dollar marketplace. So my lecture today is going to concentrate on the work of Everett and Gray, and then we're going to try to have a conversation at the end about Amanda Cote's work. For both of the authors, their position as unicorns or rarities in the gaming world have allowed them to subjectively note, experience, and discuss the deviant behavior omnipresent in digital spaces. According to Gray, given that most digital technologies resemble real-world spaces, it is easier for offline inequalities to manifest online, as Lisa Nakamura suggests. Gender, class, and race hierarchies have been carried onto the internet. So even though a user may be able to leave the body behind when entering cyberspace, the real body still lingers, creating a racialized or gendered cybertype. And our fluid selves are no less subject to cultural hegemonies, rules of conduct, and regulating cultural norms than our solid ones. Writing from their position of intersectionality as black females of particular ages, both of the authors that I'm talking about explore the issues of race and gender that arise from occupying these spaces made for boys in their pre and early teen years, but from different perspectives. Kishona Gray employs participant observation and narrative interviewing, while Anna Everett provides a broader overview of the issue. An important point to note is that in employing the intersectional perspective, both authors, in their own way, deliver what Rosberg calls the final blow to an illusory understanding of objectivity, which assumes that rigor requires the denial of all passion and the erasure of all political commitment. They do this by their contributions to the political project of decentering white hegemony in the gaming space. So you've heard me mention intersectionality, I think, 3 times in the past 2 seconds. So a lot of you understand and already know what intersectionality is, but for the others, here is a brief talk that gives us a better description and hopefully a better understanding of the concept.
I'd like to try something new. Those of you who are able, please stand up. Okay, so I'm going to name some names. When you hear a name that you don't recognize, you can't tell me anything about them, I'd like you to take a seat and stay seated. The last person standing, we're going to see what they know, okay? All right. Eric Garner. Mike Brown. Tamir Rice. Freddie Gray. So those of you who are still standing, I'd like you to turn around and take a look. I'd say half to most of the people are still standing. So let's continue. Michelle Cusseau. Tanisha Anderson. Ara Russer. Megan Hockaday. So if we look around again, there are about 4 people still standing. And actually, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I just say that to encourage transparency, so you could be seated. So those of you who recognize the first group of names know that these were African Americans who've been killed by the police over the last 2.5 years. What you may not know is that the other list is also African Americans who have been killed within the last 2 years. Only one thing distinguishes the names that you know from the names that you don't know: gender. So let me first let you know that there's nothing at all distinct about this audience that explains the pattern of recognition that we've just seen. I've done this exercise dozens of times around the country. I've done it to women's rights organizations, I've done it with civil rights groups, I've done it with professors, I've done it with students, I've done it with psychologists, I've done it with sociologists, I've done it even with progressive members of Congress. And everywhere, the awareness of the level of police violence that Black women experience is exceedingly low. Now, it is surprising, isn't it, that this would be the case? I mean, there are 2 issues involved here. There's police violence against African Americans, and there's violence against women, 2 issues that have been talked about a lot lately. But when we think about who is implicated by these problems, when we think about who's victimized by these problems, the names of these Black women never come to mind. Now, communications experts tell us that when facts do not fit with the available frames, people have a difficult time incorporating new facts into their way of thinking about a problem. These women's names have slipped through our consciousness because there are no frames for us to see them, no frames for us to remember them, no frames for us to hold them. As a consequence, reporters don't lead with them, policymakers don't think about them, and politicians aren't encouraged or demanded that they speak to them. Now, you might ask, well, why does a frame matter? I mean, after all, an issue that affects Black people and an issue that affects women, wouldn't that necessarily include Black people who are women and women who are Black people? Well, the simple answer is that this is a trickle-down approach to social justice, and many times it just doesn't work. Without frames that allow us to see how social problems impact all the members of a targeted group, many will fall through the cracks of our movements, left to suffer in virtual isolation. But it doesn't have to be this way. Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma de Graffenried. Emma de Graffenried was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired, and she believed that she was not hired because she was a black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say. That the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma de Graffenried was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But, of course, neither African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So, what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique. But in the same way that intersectionality raised our awareness to the way that Black women live their lives, it also exposes the tragic circumstances under which African American women die. Police violence against Black women is very real. The level of violence that Black women face is such that it's not surprising that some of them do not survive their encounters with police. Black girls as young as 7, great-grandmothers as old as 95 have been killed by the police. They've been killed in their living rooms, in their bedrooms. They've been killed in their cars. They've been killed on the street. They've been killed in front of their parents, and they've been killed in front of their children. They have been shot to death. They have been stomped to death. They have been suffocated to death. They have been manhandled to death. They have been tasered to death. They've been killed when they've called for help. They've been killed when they were alone, and they've been killed when they were with others. They have been killed shopping while Black, driving while Black, having a mental disability while Black, having a domestic disturbance while Black. They've even been killed being homeless while Black. They've been killed talking on the cell phone, laughing with friends, sitting in a car reported as stolen, and making a U-turn in front of the White House with an infant strapped in the back seat of the car. Why don't we know these stories? Why is it that their lost lives don't generate the same amount of media attention and communal outcry as the lost lives of their fallen brothers? It's time for a change. So what can we do? In 2014, the African American Policy Forum began to demand that we say her name at rallies, at protests, at conferences, at meetings, anywhere and everywhere that state violence against Black bodies is being discussed. But saying her name is not enough. We have to be willing to do more. We have to be willing to bear witness to the often painful realities that we would just rather not confront. The everyday violence and humiliation that many black women have had to face. Black women across color, age, gender expression, sexuality, and ability. So we have the opportunity right now, bearing in mind that some of the images that I'm about to share with you may be triggering for some, to collectively bear witness to some of this violence. We're going to hear the voice of the phenomenal Abby Dobson. And as we sit with these women, some who've experienced violence and some who have not survived them, we have an opportunity to reverse what happened at the beginning of this talk, when we could not stand for these women because we did not know their names. So at the end of this clip, there's going to be a roll call. Several black women's names will come up. I'd like those of you who are able to join us in saying these names as loud as you can, randomly, disorderly. Let's create a cacophony of sound to represent our intention to hold these women up, to sit with them, to bear witness to them, to bring them into the light.
Say her name. Say her name. Oh, say her name. Say her name. Say their names, for all the names I'll never know.
I asked Sharon Jones, Denise Fonville, Katherine Johnson, Kayla Moore, Michelle Cassell, Rakia Boyd, Shelley Frey, Tarika Yvette Smith.
Say their name.
So I said at the beginning, if we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem. Together, we've come together to bear witness to these women's lost lives. But the time now is to move from mourning and grief to action and transformation. This is something that we can do. It's up to us. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
So, in her article, Gray writes about her experience and her observations on the Xbox Live platform. For those of you that don't know, Xbox Live is Microsoft's online service for gaming and content distribution for the Xbox, Xbox 360, and Xbox One video game systems. It lets you play games against other people online, as well as download demos, trailers, and even full games. Xbox Live was launched in 2002, and Gray is writing in 2011, just as the platform arguably achieved maturity with over 20 million active users. Excuse me. Now, Gray bases her argument on a number of factors predicated on the disinhibition that the anonymity of the voice-based platform of Xbox Live facilitates. And she finds that anonymity is a principal factor leading to the disinhibition effect because users can separate their online actions from their real-world selves. Whatever they say or whatever they do cannot be linked to them in the real world. Some individuals may even justify their actions by convincing themselves that they are not connected to the online persona at all. Then she talks about invisibility, the ability to move untracked from space to online space. This invisibility gives users, she argues, the courage to say and do things that they may not normally do. In some online spaces, your identity may be known, but being physically invisible amplifies the disinhibition effect. The solipsistic introjection. Users within an online space will create a character based on the online cues present within the online space. Essentially, the other person becomes the player in your imagination or your fantasy world. And Sula, in 2004, suggested that cyberspace may become a stage where we are merely players in other people's worlds. Then she talks about dissociative imagination, where the disconnect that occurs when we view the online world as a make-believe space. According to Gray, some cyberspace users separate their online lives from their offline selves, suggesting that their online life is a game where the rules do not apply to real life. This occurs more easily in fantasy game environments where an imaginary character is played by a user. Also, this factor may not be as prevalent in a real-time, voice-based community such as Xbox Live. And the last thing that she talks about is the minimization of status and authority, the reality of many online spaces, that there's the absence of a suitable guardian supervising the space, and the absence of the traditional cues reduces the impact of authority in digital spaces. So even when authority figures are known to users, the lack of a physical presence and cues diminishes their power within the space. But she also notes that because the Xbox Live space allows for real-time voice communication, much of the racism and sexism that emerge stem from linguistic profiling. Similar to racial profiling, linguistic profiling occurs when auditory cues as opposed to visual cues are used to confirm and or speculate on the racial background of an individual. And that, in some, virtual gaming spaces have been constructed as white, masculine power structures having hegemonic control with the ability to reproduce the dominant ideology. Having established the parameters for the study, she sets out to answer two related questions. How significant is the voice in fostering linguistic profiling and creating an inequitable space for marginalized bodies? And how have women of color, as a marginalized population within this online gaming community, respond to dominant narratives and social inequalities present within the space? So the data within the study were collected from the interviews of 12 women, 8 African American and 4 Puerto Rican, although they all identified racially as Black. In relation to her first question, how significant is the voice in fostering linguistic profiling and creating an inequitable space for marginalized bodies? She writes, from my observations and interviews, Black women in Xbox Live experience discriminatory acts resulting from the label of deviance placed upon their ascribed identities as recognized through their voice. Once their voices are heard within the space, they experience inequalities. Additionally, these women perceive males as the oppressor to avoid and white women as passive bystanders, not understanding of their own victimization. Furthermore, their actions were largely dependent on their clan membership. Most importantly, many women in Xbox Live were not aware of their own marginalization within the space, although many women created their own gaming spaces within Xbox Live to avoid gamers who may engage in racist or sexist language. Further, when many women directed their anger within the space towards one another, as opposed to directing the energy towards males within the space. In speaking specifically about the Puerto Rican Killers clan, Gray says she pays particular attention to the focus they put on their collective intersectional identities. The Puerto Rican Killers created a space that is essentially free from racism, sexism, heterosexism, and nativism. To ensure this space stays safe, they are strict in who they friend and let become a member of their clan. From my observations and interviews with the Puerto Rican Killers, I found that their intersecting experiences were amplified not just by their gender and race, but also by their citizenship and linguistic abilities or inabilities. From their experiences, they recognized the inability of males and other ethnic minorities to empathize with their experience within the space. Individuals with privileged identities oftentimes take their privilege for granted. African Americans have the privilege of citizenship over ethnic minorities who migrate from black and brown countries. The black women in the study stated emphatically that white women never discriminated against them because of their race, nor did they use racist language towards them. The black women within the space only experienced racism and or sexism at the hands of males, black and white, within the space. Drawing on the work of the black feminist thinkers Audre Lorde and Patricia Hill Collins to locate her findings, Gray leaves us with the thought that the women in the study have understood their oppressed status and have made sense of their experience. This actually negates the prevailing view held of oppressed groups, that they identify with the powerful and have no valid interpretation of their own oppression. This view also holds that the oppressed are less human than their rulers and are incapable of articulating their own standpoint. As Collins confirms, black women have refused to become victims and have resisted becoming passive bystanders. This resiliency continues throughout the lives of black women, and they have translated this to the online gaming space of Xbox Live. So, as I mentioned previously, Anna Everett is not writing from the granular level and centering the experiences of particular individuals in her work. Rather, her piece gives us an overview of the answer to the question she poses in her piece: when and where does the racial problematic enter in contemporary culture's moral panics about gaming's potential dangers? This being that until the dawn of the 21st century, most public concern about video games focused on presumed dangerous behavioral consequences for minors and impressionable teens due to excessively violent content, and to a lesser extent on gender bias. Race was, up till that point in time, the structured absence in this latest iteration of generation gap politics between parent and youth cultures. Further, video game cover art and game descriptions, print and online game reviews, manufacturer strategy guides, and popular media coverage of expert gamers uncovered not only an essential and privileged male gaming subject, but one who is universalized under the sign of whiteness. The 5 themes that Everett engages with in response to the problem that she has defined are racial encryption and decryption in video games, replaying the race card, gaming's high-tech blackface and Orientalism, reading race in video game user manuals and strategy guide texts, Civilize This, or in geek speak, read the effing manual, and playing the skin game. Regarding racial encryption and decryption in video games, Everett makes the point that if whiteness is constructed as the baseline against which difference is measured and coded, we must pay particular attention to the investment in whiteness that comes from gaming culture and the impact that such an ideology of racial difference has on real-world race-based practices. A cursory search of video game covers produced this image. All hint at whiteness being centered, the race of the protagonist, but Everett also tells us that though it is crucial to be cautious about necessarily equating violent, misogynist, and racist gameplay with real-world behavioral effects, especially without regard for other important sociocultural influences such as families, schools, churches, peers, and other interpretive communities, it is incumbent upon us to address the risks and potential cultural injury inherent in the circulation of racist and sexist discourse in games and other mass media texts. So, here's a question for you. Why do you think we should care about representation in video games? When you play video games, if you play video games, do you play as yourself, or do you become the character you're controlling when you're in the game? In discussing how the race card is reinforced in video game design and code, Everett makes the point that because players become involved in the action of the character far more than sitting back and watching a character on television, they become much more aware of the moves that are programmed into the game. Any game has a certain stereotype, be it negative or positive, but a computer game is going to pass that message along pretty powerfully. She further warns that while stereotyping is part and parcel of the entertainment industry's semiotic toolkit, we should be concerned about how the negative racial stereotyping in video games can reinforce negative racial discourses. Given that most programmers are operating with whiteness as baseline, as I discussed earlier, this is what Everett terms high-tech blackface, the reinforcement of stereotyping in response to the structural racism emanating from businesses' top-down model. To put it bluntly, Everett asks, is this fetishization of digital technology's ability to render convincing representational signifiers of a limited and specific type of blackness mean what it means to get right? Furthermore, for whom are we getting it right? Regarding Asian characters in video games, Everett pays particular attention to the notion of Orientalism to try to explain the mass stereotyping of Asian characters in video games. In his book of the same name, for those of you that aren't clear on what Orientalism is, the late Edward Said defined Orientalism as the Western attitude that views Eastern societies as exotic, primitive, and inferior. Basically, an Orientalist mindset centers the Western or European American world and views the Eastern world as the other. This mindset allowed and continues to allow Westerners to rationalize much of the imperial conquest of the Eastern world through history. Simply put, Orientalism centers whiteness. In her piece, Everett uses examples drawn from published media articles and the feedback arising from same to reinforce a point. At the end of her exploration of this theme, Everett points us to what she terms the industry's parallel and support industries, computer magazines, and strategy guides for the games as a means of exploring the feedback loop between game coders and game players. So here's a brief video that explains Orientalism.
The A to Z of isms, Orientalism. The late academic Edward Said developed the term Orientalism to describe how Europeans portrayed the Orient as inferior, uncivilized, and all around weird. But importantly, Said argued this was also simultaneously about defining Europe as the Orient's opposite, superior, civilized, and all around wonderful. The actual term the Orient refers to the rising of the sun in the east and comes from the Latin word oriens. So we could think of Orientalism as Easternism, or stereotyping of the East. Orientalism, then, is the form of knowledge, in quotation marks, that authorizes and justifies the assertion of Western power over the East. But what does this actually mean? Orientalism acts like a pair of glasses that distort your vision and exaggerate cultural and religious differences. With these glasses, just about everything and everyone seems highly exotic and strange, or worse, fanatical and dangerous. Women in the Middle East, for example, appear only as exotic, a belly dancer or oppressed, a quote-unquote veiled woman, with no nuances in between. And in the early 20th century, you might have seen men portrayed as exotically romantic, or more recently, as crazy and fanatical, a terrorist, and miss all the ordinary human beings along the way. Many Arabs, Muslims, and Asians embrace this controversial term to describe the unique kind of racism they experience. Orientalism encapsulates for many how their culture, religion, and ethnicity are so often reduced to a stereotype, causing their humanity to be overlooked and culture misunderstood. Isn't this just a form of stereotyping then? Well, yes and no. Orientalism is about a much broader set of power relations. When the US government views the Middle East through Orientalist glasses, it creates policies with far-reaching consequences, from outright war waged on other countries to imposing a travel ban on whole groups of people. Perhaps the trickiest thing about Orientalism is that it's not fueled by ignorance or a simple lack of knowledge. Just the opposite. It has historically been produced as knowledge by those in positions of power, whether government officials, religious figures, or the media. For example, when President Trump stated, "I think Islam hates us. We can't allow people coming into this country who have this hatred for the United States," he effectively characterized the 1.6 billion Muslims worldwide as anti-American. Even today, Orientalism continues because it is so ingrained in how we see other peoples and cultures that it goes unnoticed. Even the term, the Middle East, is considered to be Orientalist because it standardizes a Western viewpoint by referring to West Asia and North Africa as the middle of the East. Much of what counts as knowledge about the Middle East and parts of Asia is still produced through those distorting and reductive glasses. And just like in the 18th and 19th centuries, Orientalism remains powerful because it shapes not just how people in the West view the East, but also how they view themselves.
The next theme that Everett goes on to explore is reading race in video game user manuals and strategy guide texts. In her exploration of this theme, she analyzed the racial discourses of a number of texts, 3 of which you see on the slide. What she finds is that gaming magazines are tapped to share the financial burden of marketing games to the very lucrative gamer target market, and that the political economy, the economic engine that drives this commodification, is predicated on games and game magazine editors' abilities to draw upon only a small portion of racial difference signifiers to shore up a strategic privileging of white characters in the pursuit of maximizing game points. Further than stereotyping, though, is the threat from games reinforcing imperial constructs and narratives from a Eurocentric perspective in which the good guys don't only wear white hats, but are in fact white. According to Everett, if the game strategists do not explicitly posit an evil racial other, they certainly do construct the game's native other as an antagonist. To drive her point home, Everett ends her exploration of this theme by focusing on the cover of the strategy guide for Imperialism, the Fine Art of Conquering the World. Quoting from the manual, she demonstrates the inherent biases in video games. In imperialism, there are 2 types of countries. The first type, great powers, are actors in the game, each ruled by a human or by a wily computer foe. The second type, minor nations, serve as regions for exploitation and battle by the great powers. A minor nation in imperialism cannot develop into a great power, nor can it win the game. In imperialism, colonization refers to a peaceful takeover. She writes, coupled with the game's striking cover art displayed by an illuminated white-skinned hand grasping a globe, such representational economies advance a worrisome yet unrepentant ideology that positions imperialism as spreading the necessary light of Western civilization. The next theme she goes on to explore is Civilize This, or in geek speak, read the effing manual. Through her research, Everett finds that one way the gamers of color have found to work around the coded and implicit biases in video games is to use the rules of gameplay to subvert themselves. In other words, she finds that gamers of color are circumventing the inbuilt outcomes of games by reading the game manuals before they play and developing a mastery that allows them to work to unexpected outcomes, an approach that she terms as stealth essentialism. And the final theme that she explores is playing the skin game, that of the racialization of minority or non-white skinned characters. Speaking about both Tekken Tag and Ready to Rumble boxing, she finds that though gaming sports and fighting games seem to privilege the other in their gaming rules, these characters aren't allowed to do the representation work that would be expected to come with this privileged position. Rather, she writes that, like real-life sports, all of the characters in Ready to Rumble boxing, Round 2, bear colorful names and nicknames that enliven and amplify their stereotypical personalities and delimited skills. The problem, however, is that such charged enunciations appearing in strategy guides and manuals either fire or dull users' imaginations as they select these highly racialized game skins. The official strategy guide to Ready to Rumble 2 by Prima reinforces heroic and sympathetic stereotypes of white game characters while redeploying ridiculous and pernicious ones for black and other others. Like the Black American skins, these other racialized others were marked by such rhetorical differences as Beast from the East, Maori fighting ways are savage, 400-pounder, short on ring experience but long in the tooth, lacking confidence, and so on. These are not exactly the skill levels that lure most users. These avatars are even more undesirable when white or ethnic skins representing Italy, Croatia, England, Canada, and America are described sympathetically, powerfully, and affirmatively. Turning to Tekken Tag, an image of which you have on the screen, she notes that Tekken's blonde American kickboxer, Brian Fury, is the game's Superman and is the only skin that readers are specifically recommended to select. This is particularly interesting in a first-person game of Asian martial arts, where the majority of skilled human characters are constructed as nationals of Korea, Japan, and China. This positioning, she argues, reinstalls the white male figure as the true master of these martial arts scenarios and functions to reinforce ideologies of white supremacy. In summary, both authors have engaged us in thinking hard about how the games we play and the entertainment we seek, like other forms of popular entertainment, might be considered in relation to issues of identity politics, reproduction of racist ideologies and hegemonies, despite gaming's novel expressive hardware apparatuses. In other words, at issue here has been the concern over the politics of representation regarding race and the question about gaming culture's ability to replicate or challenge existing portrayals of specific groups in films, TV shows, and print media. They want to be sure that race does not remain the structured absence or specious virtual presence in our societal concern about where the future of gaming is headed. In other words, they want us to think deeply about what it means at an intersectional level to participate in video games such as the ones we've discussed this afternoon. So, as I said, I spent a lot of time talking about Anna Everett's work and that of Kishona Gray because I thought the point of intersectionality was really very significant to the way that we frame our conversations here, given the fact that most of us are constructed as the other in the spaces that we occupy. But I'm interested in hearing from you about the work of Amanda Cote and from the women in the classroom. I want to hear if you have any experience that you would like to share about how being a woman in the gaming space has played out for you. Because, as Cote writes, the experiences of women who see themselves as standard everyday gamers, who choose to enter the gaming spaces before they were normalized as for everyone, and who often still fight to find space in the masculinized areas of gaming, are gamers also. So if you're a female gamer, or if you know someone who is, I'm really interested in hearing from you. All right. So thank you. That's my lecture for this week. I hope to see some of you online this afternoon when I go through this lecture again live. If not, see you in office hours or see you for the last lecture of the semester next week. Take care.